Hello and welcome to this Generation COVID event, which is part of the Economic and Social Research Council's Festival of Social Science. It's a collaboration between Discover Economics, the Institute for Fiscal Studies and the Economics Observatory. So thanks to all of them for having us today. I'm Lizzie Burden, economics reporter at The Telegraph, and I'm also a presenter of Droneonomics TV, a YouTube series about economic solutions to the COVID crisis. And it gives me great pleasure to say that we're joined today by Rahat Siddiqui, Latana Emadigu, Shawe Shu and Kit Harris. Rahat is an economist at the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry, which is a not-for-profit membership organisation that speaks on behalf of 190,000 businesses. Latana is a teaching associate and PhD student at the University of Manchester. Shawe is a senior research economist at the IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which is Britain's leading independent microeconomic research institute. And last but not least, Kit is an economist at the government's Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. So thank you to all of you for giving up your valuable time to join us. And if you're watching at home, we'd love for you to get involved and send us your questions by visiting www.sli.do and entering #GenerationCovid. And if there's a question that you really want to see asked, feel free to vote for it and we'll ask the most popular ones first. Now I'd like to hand over to our panel for some brief opening remarks. And my main questions to you all are what your jobs involve and why you love economics. For me, being an economics journalist gives me a broad view of events such as Brexit and the US election, and I find it really intellectually stimulating to analyse those events through data. So let's go in the order I introduced you. We'll start with Rahat, Latana, Shawe and Kit. Over to you, Rahat.
Hi, so I work...
Oh, we can't quite hear you. Let's go for Latana and we'll try and sort out your sound, Rahat, in the meantime.
Okay, so I'm Latana Emadigu. I'm a teaching associate and a researcher at the University of Manchester. My main focus is on climate change, spatial econometrics, and food prices and fuel policies. So what really attracted me to economics is trying to see how to use data to solve big problems. So you use big data to solve problems that affect virtually everybody in the world. So when we talk about climate change, for example, it is something that is not localized. It's a globalized problem. And trying to see how we could contribute from an economic perspective to the problem of solving, from an economic perspective to how we can contribute to the solution of climate change, it's something that interests me, and that's why I've been pursuing that in my research career. And I've done some series of work for looking at climate change, how to solve some climate change related problem in Africa, as well as in the US and also in some parts of Southern Asia.
Definitely a hot topic for how we can recover building back better, to quote Mr. Biden. Shawe, let's come to you. What do you do? If you can summarise for us, and why do you love economics?
Hi, so I work at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, which is a research institute looking at public economics. We do a mix of policy and academic work. So my research areas are broadly inequality and labour markets. I'm doing some work at the moment on the rise in self-employment and what that means for the labour market, the effect of the increases in minimum wages in recent years. And I've also done quite a bit of work looking at the effect of COVID-19 on inequalities. In terms of what I like about economics, a similar answer really. I like how economic theory provides a structure for thinking through public policy problems. And I like that economics gives you a set of tools to analyse data and provide evidence to answer interesting questions.
Great. Well, we're definitely going to delve a bit deeper into the question of the pandemic and inequalities. Kit, let's go to you. What do you do and why do you love economics?
Hello. Yeah, so I'm an economist for the Department of Business, Energy and Industry Strategy, as was mentioned. So I very recently moved teams, but Formerly, I was working as an equity finance analyst, which involved monitoring funding ecosystem for small companies and then identifying how we can support them throughout the pandemic. And so why do I love economics? I think two reasons really. First of all is its universality. So many of my friends will tie economics exclusively to banking and money. I think economic thinking crops up constantly in everyday life, whether it's organizing your day, playing games, or even strange things like watching David Attenborough. And then secondly, I think it's a really practical subject to understand. I think the world today can be thought of as an econocracy, and whether that's a good thing or not, the world is run by economists in government, central banks, the IMF, World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and so I think it's really important to have a good understanding of how the world works, and for that, I think economics is essential.
Really interesting that you have both private and public sector experience. So it'd be good to get your perspective later on some of the questions from the audience. And Rahat, let's try you again. Can we hear you now? Yeah, just faintly if you speak up. So what do you do and why do you love economics?
Yeah, I would head off. And it's a membership of we kick off of almost 190,000 a day. And so I work in the economic policy team, and what that means is that I'm the middleman between hearing what businesses have as problems, especially challenges with COVID or Brexit, and then feeding that back into government and thinking about solutions that we can have or produce as a result of that. So some of the things that we've been working on is trying to understand like the furlough scheme, that was kind of something that was backed by the CBI, and kind of just thinking about the mechanics of how that would work, and really small things about at the start of the pandemic, things like actually a lot of tax related things would be posted by HMRC, and we had to kind of let government know that actually if everything's shut down, then you can't really ever fill in those forms or let HMRC know. So there are even really small things that you thought you didn't realise actually make sure the economy keeps working. So in terms of what I love about economics, I think it's that ability to have an impact and have a positive impact and kind of really figure out how the world's working and think of solutions for that.
So an econocracy, the furlough scheme, you've been given loads of food for thought there. So if you're watching, don't forget to ask your questions on www.sli.do and enter #GenerationCovid. Now we're going to start with some questions that were sent in ahead of the event. Let's go to the first one now from Georgie.
In the current state of the pandemic, racial and social inequalities have become more apparent and visible. When the pandemic is over, will the current situation of inequality be even worse? And how will the new state affect the economy?
What a massive question. So I know that the IFS has done loads of work on inequality and how different inequalities have changed because of the pandemic. Let's go to you first then, Shawe. What's your answer to that massive question?
So I'll try not to take up the entire hour. But yeah, you're absolutely right. In many ways, the pandemic has widened existing inequalities. So you mentioned ethnic inequalities. We know that ethnic minorities are more likely to work in jobs that expose them to the pandemic, and therefore they've suffered higher death rates. We also know that the sectors that have been hardest hit, so things like hospitality and retail, are sectors that are not very well paid to begin with. So again, the lowest earners have seen the largest hit to their incomes and their livelihoods. In terms of what this means in the future, I think a big question is how much the changes we've seen so far are just temporary, and once we have a vaccine, we'll just go back to normal, or whether some of these changes become permanent. And I think actually, as the pandemic has dragged on, it seems quite likely that some changes, like working from home, for example, will become permanent. And it may well have implications on inequality. So, for example, if we see increased demand in the future for relatively high-skilled things like online e-commerce, and a fall in demand for low-skilled jobs like hospitality or in-person retail, then that might further widen earnings inequalities in the future. I think another question really is how policy responds, right? So at the moment, we've seen this increase in inequality in the short term, but I think there's also been a heightened understanding of the importance of policy for mitigating inequalities. So we've seen these schemes like the furlough scheme introduced, which replaced a really high share of people's wages. And I think, if the pandemic makes people realise more of a need for social insurance in a welfare state, then perhaps in the long term that might reduce inequalities.
Rahat, you mentioned your work on the furlough scheme. How will the pandemic affect inequalities, and how will those inequalities affect business?
I think, it's obviously hard to say. I don't know if that's a cop-out as answer. But I think there are a few things that I think businesses kind of are just very aware of them a lot more. I guess the relationship between employees and employers kind of really changed with the pandemic. You kind of saw employers learning a lot more about kind of the situation of their employees, and kind of, the furlough scheme came out of, this desire that a lot of businesses didn't just want to make their employees redundant because they didn't have the cash for what seemed like a temporary period. But I think, I guess in the context of 2020, there has been a big onus of doing something that's a bit more tangible and ongoing, and especially just addressing things like racial inequalities and social inequalities, of kind of making sure that the activism that came out from business is something that's long term, and it's not kind of just something that's you put on social media. So I think even within the CBI, we're championing the change the race ratio, about having representation of people from BAME backgrounds within FTSE 100 companies, and kind of within across boards in general. So I think there is kind of an impetus now to accelerate a lot of the things that I guess we knew were systemic problems, and kind of making sure that businesses are doing what they can.
At the start of the crisis, there was a lot of talk about people who are falling through the cracks of the government's various schemes. But it's obviously something that the Chancellor and the government have tried to get a hold of more. So what's the government's thinking now on how the pandemic will affect inequality?
Yeah, so I guess that's a very broad question, and I can't really speak for the government as in entirety. But I think looking at this pandemic, it's almost like it's been designed to exacerbate all of the worst inequalities in our country. Whether that's gender inequality, racial inequality, regional inequality, income inequality. So I think it is a real challenge to the government. And I think, at least talking from my own personal experience, one of the kind of inequalities that maybe isn't talked about as much is investment inequality. So because of everyone suddenly working from home, there is huge difficulties for investors in operating due diligence on new companies. And so this means that there's all these promising, very small businesses that haven't received funding before, and as a result of the pandemic are now far less likely to receive investment. And so we've seen like the level of first-time VC fundraisings for the smallest businesses absolutely fall off a cliff, as this pandemic makes it more difficult for investors to investigate new potential companies to invest in. And so this is going to have, this could have a real lasting impact in the future, as the equity funding pipeline is damaged at the bottom end, and means that there's going to be a shortage of successful, business cases, business stories in the future, like the next, Brewdog, Monzo, Deliveroo. Yeah.
I'm sure it's really interesting to anyone who's watching and maybe wants to be an entrepreneur when they finish school, or if they go to university after that, how the economy could be completely different after the pandemic. Latana, let's come to you. What's your view? I'll remind you of the question. When the pandemic is over, will the current situation of equality be even worse, and how will the new state affect the economy?
All right. Yeah. I mean, from different economic perspective and from a different economic model, there are quite an insinuation that the inequality gap is going to widen in different perspective. The health inequality, social inequality, economic inequality, and also if in terms of the response rate, the response rate at which each country is trying to mitigate or adapt to this pandemic also contributes to the widening economic inequality. For example, you see countries in the developing world like the sub-Saharan Africa and their response to the pandemic, as well as those in the those that are experiencing the economic growth in the developed world, like the Americas, the European countries. This response will definitely widen the divide between the economic impact is going to have in these countries after the pandemic. And of course, we expect that things may not really return back to normal in terms of the way, because human beings are quite adaptative. At least if you can't, biologists will tell us anyone that can't adapt will eventually die. So since human beings are behaviorally, we adapt, and adapting to what we see now is what is going to really make us to continue the way probably we are. For example, if businesses find out that they are still meeting up with their expected production, and yet because workers are working from home, they are having they're having to save more of the overhead costs. Even after the pandemic, they will still want to continue like that. So I guess the inequality is going to widen in terms of the way the countries respond, and the way I'm looking at it from a macro perspective now, from the way countries respond to the pandemic, as well as we may not return back to where we were, because there may be we have discovered a new way of doing things, which may even be less costly and even more effective in terms of the outputs.
It's really interesting to think of it not just on a national level, but on an international level, how those inequalities might change. We're going to go now to a question from Francesca.
How long will our new normal last, and will there ever be an old normal again?
There's another huge question. So Kit, your job is making policy for the future. So what's the government's thinking on this? I know you can't speak for the whole government, but what are the thoughts going around in the government at the moment? How long will the new normal last, and will there ever be our old normal again?
Yeah, well, I might not be able to speak for the government, but I can offer you my own viewpoint. Yeah, so I think one change we're going to see for sure is part-time working from home is likely to stay. I think before the crisis, 19% of people worked from home part of the time, and now we're going out of the crisis. Well, potentially going out of the crisis, hopefully soon, and we're seeing around 40% of people planning on working from home at least part of the time after the crisis. That said, I think the number of people fully working from home after the pandemic will be limited, because there are huge benefits from being in the office. Drawing on my personal experience, I've just started a new team, and I haven't met any of my team members in person yet. And I think that can be a real barrier. Yeah, I think there's going to be a gradual, sustained re-emergence of people as this new vaccine is hopefully rolled out soon. I think that said, I think it's going to be particularly hard on people that have been shielding for long periods of time, and they're going to see a real psychological impact as they go from almost no contact for up to 12 months to back to normal. But kind of drawing back onto the economic side, I'm personally going to be really interested to see whether the government's new laissez-faire attitude to pumping large amounts of money into the economy continues. So the Bank of England has currently bought 200 billion in government bonds to prop up wage earners and businesses. And then looking back to 2010, this is a huge change from political discourse from the Cameron and Osborne years, when there was a sort of fixation on the deficit and reducing it. And now we've got very low interest rates. So it'll be really interesting to see whether, as the government has to spend more to repair and rebuild from the crisis, whether we see a sort of early manifestation of modern monetary theory, or whether inflation will rise, and whether we'll see more frugal spending from the government.
A new economic era, potentially. You heard it here first. Rahap, so Kit mentioned work from home. You've got a very unique perspective because you've got an ear to the world of business. Are you hearing from companies that even though it may be cheaper and more productive to work from home, that actually they want to just go back to the old normal and go back to the 9 to 5, Monday to Friday? Or do you think that it may be that the world of business never returns to how it was before?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to get to that kind of imaginary world of everybody just working from home and like the office disappears. I think the practical reason, one of them, is that actually like lease tenancies for commercial properties are like the average length of it is about 6 to 7 years. So lots of businesses are tied into these contracts for offices anyway, so they might as well just they'll have to carry on using this office property or retail property. Maybe the nature of it might change. I think we've seen a cultural shift in certain industries where perhaps there was a taboo around working from home. I think in some professional services, but you didn't typically see people working from home. I think like in the legal profession, it wasn't really a thing that you did, but I think they've kind of been able to see that actually people can work from home and we can kind of make it work. I think from what we hear is like, with the onboarding of new staff and younger staff, it's really, it's not the same trying to get to integrate new members of the team, especially young people who are kind of just coming in from university or education more broadly and kind of making them feel part of the team. I think that's the challenge with this going on for a bit longer. I think that the other issue is of course that, people like meeting each other. But I think there has been an acceleration within sectors. So I think we saw retail struggling for a very long time, and there has been kind of this acceleration to go to e-commerce. And I think also, I guess, with just the nature of the restrictions of, it's difficult, I guess, to go to your high street shop and kind of the restriction in place, trying to try on clothes and whatever, or if you're not comfortable wearing masks are going in a one-way system, you find, you might as well just order it all online. I think those are the two things that have accelerated a change that was already happening, but I guess the way that we have to now reorganize ourselves might disincentivize people to kind of carry on as they would normally. But I don't think we're probably going back to all just stay in our kind of box rooms and work from home. I think in the same way that schools have gone back as much as they can to maintain some normality, I think we'll see the same for workers.
And Latana, you're at the University of Manchester. I'm wondering how the pandemic will change education. It's probably the next stage for a lot of the people watching. We've talked about the world of work. What will be the new normal for education, universities, or do you think it'll go back to the old normal?
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, most times, if you look at economic history, shocks don't normally leave society where they found them. I mean, if you look at the Industrial Revolution and look at some other major shocks, especially shocks like that has this kind of wide-reaching impact. Definitely, it has transformed the way of living, our way of living, as well as our way of delivering education, both at the primary level, the secondary level, and the tertiary level. However, there is a push that for education, it's not very productive. From the report we've gathered, it's not very productive to continue in the new normal and dispensing education in this kind of setting. So there is a push to go back to the old normal. Of course, the students are pushing, given that they are paying the same tuition fee, those that had face-to-face interaction as well as other physical interaction, teaching and learning process. So it's very tough to adapt to such a situation like this. It has a kind of profound effect on education, on especially university education, where perhaps students are supposed to be in the laboratory. Students are supposed to meet up with their supervisor. Students are supposed to, discuss in groups and then come up with them. You have teamwork and group meetings and come up with team project, but they can't really meet and they have to do all these things online. I mean, for that, we are still studying. We don't really know what the overall effect is for now, but we are conjecturing that it will have a negative effect on their studies. And that is why the University of Manchester is pushing, still relying on and depending on government guidelines to see that students are given that opportunity to have a physical, in-class, a kind of face-to-face teaching and learning process.
Now, Xiaowei, you work at the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and Kit hinted at this earlier. Is there going to be is this a new era of taxing and spending? It's different to other crises, it seems. Have we gone to a new normal in the way that a crisis is fiscally handled?
Well, I don't know that I can speak on behalf of the government on that. I think it certainly has raised awareness of the importance of a social welfare net, one which, in the UK has been stripped down over a period of years over austerity. And I think a lot of people have ended up falling back on the welfare net who haven't expected to do so before and really quite shocked by the low levels of support that they get. So in terms of increasing demand for a bigger welfare state, I think that's quite possible that we'll see something like that. In terms of what the government does, I mean, I don't think I can speak to that.
Who knows? Well, speaking of the welfare net, I think we've got a question on just that topic. It's from Paulina.
Increasingly, our society has adopted a more collective approach rather than a selfish approach. Therefore, could this be a signal for economists around the world to update traditional economic theory, which has always identified humans as selfish and utility maximizing beings?
Another head scratcher, and this time it's coming at you, Latana. You're in the academic space. Do economists' models need to be fundamentally rethought after this pandemic? Oh, we can't quite hear you.
You can't hear me?
Now we can. There you go.
All right. Okay, good. So thanks, Paulina, for that great question. First of all, let me just say that there are different economic theory approaches to the studying of human behavior. Of course, the traditional one we know by Adam Smith and the classicals is that man is self-centered or selfish. But over the years, we've seen that some of these some human behaviorists have come to also add to what we know now, that human beings are altruistic in some sense, and we've seen that happen. So the pandemic actually is not what, in a way, has made human beings or has made the society or people to work together collectively. For example, in trying to solve the problem of climate change, which had been in existence before the pandemic, there has been a lot of cooperative efforts amongst nations as well as amongst household or agents or firms to be able to beat down the number of the quantity of carbon emission. However, it's with the way we are, with the way society and people are working collectively to ensure that we overcome this pandemic, it's not out of place to believe that economists are already looking at updating what they already know about the behavior of man. Like I said, it's not new. We already have studies even way back into the 80s and 70s that already, we anticipate that human beings are altruistic in the face of certain events. And I've given a good example like climate change, something that affects them. So if there is something that affects everybody, we all try to work collectively, like climate change, like this pandemic. So anytime there is an event that affects the common good of the society, everybody comes together collectively to work. So it has been an economic theory that has been in existence, and it's not just being born as a result of this pandemic.
I mean, is it true though that people have been more collective in spirit because of the pandemic, shall we? I mean, you've seen people panic buying toilet roll. That's not very thoughtful of your fellow man. You've seen people not wearing masks. People have been more selfish, haven't they?
So on the matter of toilet roll in particular, I think IFS research has found that the sort of panic buying that we've seen is actually driven by a very, very small share of the population. And actually, most people had bought a little more than they would normally buy, just to have a bit of a fallback in case shops close down. But they haven't been massively going out and hoarding in the way that many news reports have made it out to be. So I'm not sure whether altruism has increased, but on the question of, whether economics is fit to study altruistic behaviour, I think I absolutely agree with Latana there. I think, behavioural economics has been, quite a fashionable thing in economics lately, but this is really not new. There's been models going back to the 80s, 70s looking at altruistic behaviour, and I think this conception that economists think people are, utility maximizing and selfish, or selfish in particular, comes from a lot of the models that people come across when they're just starting to study economics. And there, I think, a model is only useful insofar as it helps simplify reality to make a certain point a bit clearer, right? So a model of a selfish utility maximizer might be helpful if you're thinking about people's choices over what to buy, but they're much less helpful when you're thinking about why people engage in volunteering, for example. And studies of this sort of pro-social altruistic behaviour have been existent in economics for a long time, and so have these models.
The government in the UK, but also governments around the world, have not only got to solve the problem of the pandemic, but also, as Latana mentioned, climate change. So do we need to change our models? Do we need to stop thinking just of humans as selfish, or do we need to be a bit more optimistic about human nature?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really interesting question, Paulina. And I think on the whole, looking at neoclassical economic theory assumptions specifically, they definitely do need updating. But I think I'm not sure that this increase in cooperation and altruism necessarily invalidates the assumption of people being a selfish homo economicus, because often it's in someone's best interests to actually cooperate with someone because it provides them with utility. Like there's the saying, there's no such thing as a selfless good deed, because every good deed will always bring that nice warm glow. So I think you can still act selfishly and be altruistic and help your fellow human. But I think I definitely think there's a case to be made for economists needing to do a better job of accounting for the utility that people derive from that warm glow that you get from knowing, for example, that poor children are not going hungry, because as we've clearly seen with the whole Marcus Rashford campaign recently, it's not just the children, the hungry children, that are getting utility from support. It's also bringing a lot of joy to a lot of people, because we've seen that everyone clearly cares about it very much.
I think this very deep question was tackled on an episode of Friends between Joey and Phoebe once. Kit knows exactly what I'm talking about there. Rahat, what's your view?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I'm probably going to add anything very contrary to what's been said. I think, I think there are kind of assumptions in models, but I think a lot of them are often then caveated. Actually, in reality, we know this often doesn't happen, or we see people behave differently. We give gifts because we value that as people. We could obviously give the monetary value of that, but we don't most of the time. And so that kind of sustains a lot of what we do. And I think a lot of activity that happened during the pandemic, even kind of within businesses, kind of really supporting their supply chains and not and being very concerned with that, I think was shown that actually it's not just about kind of caring about your own self-interest, even though you could probably get by is that you do care about your employees and you do care about kind of what happens to people's livelihoods.
Now we've got time for one last question that was submitted beforehand, and this one's from Lucas.
What will happen to the economy if the virus becomes endemic?
So endemic, a problem if it's something that we have to live with rather than expect to permanently eradicate. So let's say it's like chicken pox. Shaway, what's your view?
I mean, I think if it does become endemic, it will probably be in a much more weakened form, right? So it'll just be another version of the flu, and that will affect society much less. I think a related interesting question is what happens if these sort of shocks become more common. So if, after we've had a vaccine for COVID-19 and get rid of COVID-19, there'll be a COVID 2020, not 2020, 2021, So, and Latana mentioned climate change. What happens if we start seeing climate change related shocks? So massive areas of the country being flooded every now and then, for example. And I think if that's the case, then it'll be really important to think more about providing social insurance, giving people the opportunity to retrain, and just making our society much more robust to shocks in the future.
Rahat, with the massive news this week that we might have a vaccine soon, is it too pessimistic to think that this is something that we're going to have to live with forever?
I mean, as a eternal pessimist, I would say no, but I think that the probably on the upside is the fact that actually a lot of people have businesses are prepared to be able to deal with working with COVID. So I guess with the lockdown that we've seen this time, we see that a lot of things don't have to shut down, or that they're kind of able to deal with difficulties in their supply chain, which kind of in March we didn't see that kind of resilience. So I think going forward, if we do find that we're kind of living with COVID for longer than expected, I don't think that the harms to the economy and to society will probably be as dramatic as we saw earlier on in the year. I do think the question is about how prepared we are for kind of these large, massive shocks that we kind of assume is kind of once in a lifetime, and now we've had two so far. And we're probably going to see, it seems like there might be more. And I think that's the concern of how prepared are we for kind of thinking ahead and kind of appreciating actually it's worth investing in preparing for these.
And Kit, surely not everyone's going to agree to take the vaccine, and we're going to have to inoculate some people before others. So surely it is something that we're going to have to live with for a really long time.
Yeah, I mean, you'd hope that with a new vaccine and some degree of herd mentality, herd immunity from the people that don't take the vaccine, I can skeptically say that COVID-19 won't become endemic. Fingers crossed. But I think, as Shaway was saying, I think the likelihood of a new pandemic is very high, given the level of globalization that we were seeing before COVID-19, and the industrialization of farming animals at the moment. So I think, if we do see that sort of virus again, I think we're going to see an exacerbation of recent trends. So looking at investment again, I think we're going to see more investment in technology companies and an ever increasing market share going to the most established companies like Amazon, Google, Apple, Microsoft. They're in a position to capitalize from people spending more time at home and people wanting to choose familiarity over uncertainty.
And Latana, do you think that this is something that we'll have to put up with forever, like the flu or chickenpox?
There are those that feel that sometimes people make comparison between Ebola and this type of COVID-19. But I was writing in a paper recently, and I said that, and I made a claim that those two are not comparable. They are not comparative because the means of transmission is quite different. And if you look at the means of transmission for COVID, it's just like the flu. It's just that it's deadlier than the flu, and that's it. But I'm thinking in the face of a vaccine, we will soon get over this, I believe. I mean, that's it. Once there is a vaccine, it may still be there, but it may not really be endemic. So I don't want to use the word endemic, but there may still be a spot of, COVID here and there. But eventually, we're going to get over it with herd immunity and with the vaccine. We're optimistic that, and the government also now being in a stronger position to also get ready for in case of any other outbreak, because this has taught, just like the financial crisis taught economists to, shore up their modeling. This outbreak has also, taught the governments of the world to shore up their response to outbreaks. So I think now we won't wait for an outbreak to happen before we start. So we are now being proactive, waiting for, assuming that an outbreak will happen. So we are just waiting for it to happen. We are ready.
Well, thank you to everyone who sent in questions via Slido. There's still time to send in your questions before the end of the session, and to vote if you see a question there that you'd like to be asked. So just go to www.sli.do and use #GenerationCovid. We've got 29 so far. Let's go to the top rated question. It says, how do you think spending habits will change? Will the younger demographic be a generation of savers and not spenders? Will everyone be taping cash to the bottom of their beds? Let's go to you, Xiaowei. What's your view?
I think that depends on whether young people are optimistic about the future or not. So if they think that the economy will be forever smaller and they can't expect to increase their incomes and also can't expect much of a welfare state, then they might end up saving much more. I think a lot of savings behavior just depends on expectations of the future. I think in terms of savings over the pandemic, it's been incredibly unequal, because on the one hand, people with lots of disposable income who normally spend it traveling or going to restaurants and shops haven't been able to do so and have been forced to save. But on the other hand, you have lots of people who've been depleting their savings because they've lost their jobs. So people falling into massive debt. So it's also not the case that over the course of the pandemic, everyone's just been piling lots of money under their beds, as you said.
Now we've got a question that speaks directly to your area of research, Latana. Should a country like India, which is so large, have implemented a lockdown, and can developing countries ever recover from the disastrous effects of COVID-19?
I mean, it's very difficult to say yes or no. It depends on some factors. For example, COVID-19 I'm writing a research presently to show that areas that are quite hot are less prone to be affected by COVID-19, and that's why you see most parts of Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, really have quite less reported cases as well as less reported deaths. So on the other hand, you have countries that are quite cold that are still developing, probably in Latin America or probably in Southeast Asia. And then these countries are highly hit with a big number of COVID cases as well as COVID death. So one thing that makes the disparity for me in my research I'm doing is the climate structure. However, I'm also doing. These are not really. These are just the research I do. So I don't want to say they are facts yet until they've been peer reviewed. And so we've also done. We are also doing currently doing a work to show that actually lockdowns do not really contribute to do not contribute in a very significant way in reducing the number of COVID cases as well as COVID deaths. That lockdowns do not really, I mean, the effect is quite insignificant, unlike the social distancing as well. And so I don't think lockdown would have made India, from the research we are doing, which is still is being reviewed presently. I don't think India, if India had locked down earlier, probably from what we find out, the effect would not have been significant.
Our next question comes from Alexander. He asks, should they charge people for the vaccine if they're not high risk? I'll put that to you, Rahat.
No, I knew that was coming to me. I I mean, I guess we're already seeing people being charged for the tests already. In certain ways, we see people being charged for the flu. I don't want to kind of take a stance. I guess it's questionable. And I guess this comes to the equity issues that we'll see even with kind of on a global level of countries that can't afford to buy kind of bulk vaccines. Should they then not be allowed to have access to the vaccine? So it's a question of like need and kind of exposure. I don't do anything on economic health, so I don't want to put my flag anywhere. But I think I guess the reason that we've changed our lives so much is because of the hospitalization rate that happens to a lot of people that are in high risk categories, and we've kind of made that change to our lives across the country and across the world. I don't think it would really be a controversial issue if people that aren't at risk of COVID were then at the back of the queue for a vaccine. So that's my view.
I also want to put that question to you.
In the current state of the pandemic, racial and
because obviously the companies that are developing the vaccines are businesses. So surely if you don't have people who can afford the vaccines paying for them, you might take away the incentive for those companies to make money out of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think my personal opinion is that the vaccine should be distributed to people that have been hit hardest from this pandemic. Not least because I think in providing, if you charge poorer people for a vaccine, then you're going to provide a huge incentive not to buy the vaccine, and actually greatly reduce the potential impact in eradicating COVID that it could have. So yeah.
So we've got mostly students watching today, and I bet they're wondering if they become an economist, how that will help in this post-COVID world. And our next question is, in what way would you say economists can help the world recover from COVID? Xiaowei, what's the role of economists? That's your job. What do you? How do you see? What gets you out of bed in the morning to help the world recover from COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the contribution that economists generally make in society, right? I guess the need for policy making has just increased massively because of this pandemic. But I think economists can help inform what policies are likely to be effective. They can help diagnose the problems. So with COVID in particular, it's brought a whole set of new problems onto the table, but it's also exacerbated a lot of the problems that were already here, right? So COVID has increased inequalities, but those inequalities were in our system before COVID hit. So I think economists can do a really important job of both diagnosing those problems and studying the types of policies that are likely to alleviate them.
Now, the next question is an education question. What effect on long-term productivity do you think that cancelling exams will have, Latana?
There are two schools of thought in this case. There are those that believe that it's a way of measuring an individual's ability to be productive in life, and there are another school of thought that feel that's the wrong way of judging an individual's ability to be productive or an individual's intelligent quotient. But in a system where exams are being exalted, I'll not be true if I say that cancelling exams will not affect productivity, because I mean the generation of COVID, the student generation of COVID we have now, it's really going to affect them, because by the time they graduate, they will have to write an exam for an interview, or maybe write, and if they have not been exposed to all these things, they don't know what exam looks like. They don't know how to really work as a team in the class. They don't have all these soft skills that you get from classroom experience or from writing an exam. Then it will be very difficult for them to compete in the labor market by the time they are coming out of school, and that may really affect their chances of being employed. Maybe not their chances of being productive, but their chances of being employed. to at least be given an opportunity to show how productive they could have been, even without an exam.
And Latana, another one for you. Do you think that COVID-19 could actually be beneficial to some countries' economies?
I didn't get that, please.
Do you think that COVID could actually be beneficial to some countries' economies?
I mean, it's definitely, you see, in any crisis, there are always the gainers and the losers. Those that are, for example, I wrote a particular article and I made a case that countries that export food, for example, countries that export food to food exporting countries tend to benefit from this COVID crisis, especially in places like India, Thailand, that export foods to African countries, and now that there is closure of borders, with all the prices will go up, and by the time for you to get food imported into your country, you pay more. So definitely some countries, depending on what they do, of course, some countries will also be losers, like those that depend on natural resources. I think in terms of the economic impact, it is Africa is worst hit because, number one, they depend on natural resources, which is not actually, there is no need for oil or anything at this time where people are sitting at home. So the oil prices has crashed, and then also they import most of their food. So the food importing countries are benefiting, and the food exporting countries rather are benefiting, while the food importing countries, which happen to be mostly in sub-Saharan Africa, are losing from this pandemic.
Now, one of the big debates of this crisis is what shape the recovery will take, and there's been a debate of an alphabet soup of options. There's been a V, a W, an L, a J, a sideways J, a K, and we've got a question now. Based on estimates, how long do you think it'll take for the UK's GDP to return to pre-COVID levels? Rahat, we had some new figures out this morning. What do you reckon?
I mean, if the UK's behaviour from the past 10 years is anything to go off, I don't think we're probably going to have that bounce back V that some people thought. Even our productivity, I guess, hasn't really recovered since 2010. So I think it's a bit optimistic to assume that after such an unpredictable crisis, we're going to see that happen now. But I do think perhaps it'll be an opportunity to really move to sectors where we perhaps didn't really have the courage to make those change, and kind of that whole build back better, or kind of greening the economy. Sort of a lot of those initiatives that seemed that they were too expensive, or actually it would just require such a major change in the way businesses organize themselves, that it's kind of put off. I guess that procrastination might not exist anymore, but I guess the returns and the kind of the benefits from that probably won't happen overnight for us to see UK GDP return to what it was in February. And even then, I think, we weren't doing too well even in February. So I don't think we should strive just to return to Q1 in 2020.
Now we've got another question here from Natasha. She asks, how will the government pay off the massive debts they've incurred during the pandemic? And how will this result in severe austerity for years to come? Kit, this is something that you touched on. The public finances are obviously a huge issue, a huge concern with all the spending on the furlough scheme and everything else. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really, really good question, and one that I'd love to know myself. I think I believe that, as I was saying earlier, political discourse has kind of shifted from the kind of focus on eradicating the deficit at all costs. And I think, a lot of people have become wise to, the massive reductions in productivity, and, the substantial drops in people's welfare that austerity has brought since, in the last decade or so. So, I don't think anytime soon, at least, that there is any appetite to impose austerity again. And also, I think the way public services have been cut over the last 10 years or so, I don't think there's much room to cut them anymore. I think, and then equally, if we look at this government that's just come in, it's very with Dominic Cummings, I think there's a very big push for investment in tech and in renewable energy. And so, I mean, if my personal opinion is that I don't think we're going to see a reimposition of austerity like we saw after the financial crisis, at least not in the coming years. But who knows?
So we've got time for just one more question. It's a lucky dip, so whoever, you can wave at me if you want to take it. How will university graduates be following this economic crisis in terms of job seeking and loans? Which postgrads are going to be affected the most? Who wants to take that one? Don't all put your hands up at once. I'm picking on you, Latana. It's yours.
Okay, so there are opportunities. Today again, we got a message from the university that the government is making some severe austerity loan available for students who has been affected by this. So it's important to really find out from the university where if you and the university you intend to apply to, you find out what kind of help they have for students that are, depending on if you're a UK student or an EU student, then you may have different, but the government has really made funds available for students that are really struggling, one, and also economics, because basically there is no aspect of this crisis that is not covered by economics. We have those in the health economists looking at it from one angle. We have those in behavioral economics looking at it from how firms, agents behave. We have those from climate economics, from development economics looking at how. So there is no aspect of economics that is not useful in solving the problem at hand or in mitigating or overcoming this COVID crisis. So recently, universities I think if you go to Econ Job Market, the European Economics Association website, you will find a lot of PhD or postgraduate and master's opportunity to study or to go into research in one of these broad areas, but pertaining to COVID crisis or COVID or pandemic kind of study. So the economics of COVID covers a lot of aspects, and then they are widely sought after in universities, and government is making funds available to universities to be able to help students that are in severe financial crisis.
Brilliant. Well, that's all we've got time for. But thank you so much for watching this Generation COVID event. Rahat, Latana, Shawe and Kit, it's been a real pleasure hearing from all of you. And thanks so much to our audience members who sent in such thought-provoking questions. Thanks as well to the Economic and Social Research Council and to Discover Economics, the IFS and the Economics Observatory for supporting this event. That's all from me, and thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.